Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And today we begin a series of examinations, might be the right word, of how people in our area have enjoyed life. The story of recreation. Now, we have to remember that it doesn't make any difference when you lived or where you lived. You always enjoyed having fun, and Pensacola certainly was no different. And of course, if we take the story back to the 1820s and 30s and 40s, it was difficult to find recreation time and subjects for recreation because people worked so hard. The old story that a woman's work was never done, but a man might work from sun to sun. But nonetheless, people were busy, and there was little time and little space for people to have what we would today call fun. But they did have some. If we look at the period prior to the war between the states, the average family would have had a number of things in-house that they enjoyed. Number one, many families, those that of course became literate, enjoyed books, particularly the Bible. They enjoyed card games. They enjoyed the first of what we today call board games. And of course, periodically, churches and others gathered people together for either church revivals or for just plain fun, for socializing or for dancing. And music became a part of this too. Not large formal groups, but the fiddler, the drummer, and this sort of thing. People who enjoyed playing the harmonica, the Jew's harp. They brought things together and had fun doing this. Singing around the piano, for those homes that had a piano, became a family joy. And this was part of life. Now, all through this period, of course, there were many who enjoyed hunting and fishing, and we would call them both a sport and a source of food in many cases, but that's the way things were. And if we look at some of the ordinances that were passed by the early city councils, we found that they were concerned about keeping order when people enjoyed the opportunity to play in a billiard hall or to play what they called faro. And of course, one of the things that the early councils were very concerned about was the periodic coming to the area here of circuses and other forms of entertainment like that. They were very careful about the way these things were regulated because I guess sometimes they must have gotten out of hand. But basically that's the way things were up until we come into the period beginning in 1870. And of course, as the 1870s began and we began to enjoy the fruits of the lumbering era and commercial fishing and naval stores and all that, people began to make money, and while they still worked very long hours, they had resources with which to enjoy some of what they had made. And we get into the 1870s, and you begin to see men in particular finding outdoor or out-of-home entertainment and enjoyment in what we would today call lodges or social organizations. It was then, for example, that people began to enjoy, to become part of the Masonic order, to the Knights of Columbus, to the Knights of Pythias, to the Elks. And when by the time we get into the early 1880s, the men of greater success formed the first, what we would call a gentleman's club. This became the Osceola Club, and Osceola was a very posh arrangement. After a few years, it was located in the Blunt Building, in the Brent Building, a beautiful place where people could go, and it was a very exclusive club because the ladies were invited there only once a year, and that was usually for some form of Christmas social. So as we move into the 1880s, the idea of books and games and this sort of thing and dancing became broadened out just a little bit, and then in 1885, of course, the first great breakthrough occurred. And this was the opening of the Pensacola Opera House. And looking back well over 120 years, we have to recognize what a tremendous change the Opera House made here. Now, the Sullivan brothers who built it were wise enough to recognize that in places like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, there were businesses being created that put together regular tours of artistic talent. And these people were, of course, now we had a railroad in Pensacola, they could arrive here regularly, and all sorts of things, anything from a minstrel show to a play, to acts, to presentations even by the John Philip Sousa Band. All of these things were exciting entertainment, and of course now people had the money money, and because they did, they began to come downtown, enjoy the theatricals 2-3 times a week, because the bill of fare changed, often changed that frequently. And once of course they came down for that sort of thing, they then graduated after that to maybe a dinner at one of the fashionable restaurants. And of course the ladies, as they came, being fashion being what it is, a fine lady who came to a show on Tuesday night with a brand new outfit certainly couldn't wear the same outfit on Thursday, or the same one again on Saturday. So the clothiers began to profit from this as well. So all through this period, the Opera House became a new catalyst, a cycle. Now, sports, as we know them today in the 21st century, had their origins about this same time here in Pensacola. We have a record, for example, of football being played in the park nearby on Thanksgiving Day between a group of fashionable young men from Pensacola and a similar group from Mobile. They played out there, apparently drew a nice crowd, had a good time, and of course the rules were quite different then, the game having just been in force at the college level for just a few years. We have a record in the Pensacola City Directory for the year 1885 that shows us that we had a formalized baseball team. It was called the Gophers, of all things, and it was led by a man named Daniel Bergen, and they played their baseball games. The directory says they played a game every week at Magnolia Bluff Baseball Park. I don't know where that was, but nonetheless, this was not professional sport, but it was fun. And shortly thereafter, as we get into the 1890s and a little bit beyond, baseball became much larger. And as a result of that, many of the lumber mills and places like the railroad began to sponsor baseball teams, and these teams would play one another locally, and of course they would occasionally play teams from Mobile or even from Birmingham. So that form of sport began to proceed as well. As we hit the turn of the century, we begin to see a slight change taking place, because now our churches began to be much more active in entertainment. Well, we shouldn't call it entertainment at a church, I guess, but it was part of the overall organization, because now churches became far more effective with music. You began to see some of the newer churches, particularly as they built new sanctuaries, equipping them with better sound equipment, and also with in some cases a fine organ, and consequently the church music became a source of pride. And as that developed, of course the women of the church began to be much more interested also in providing certain forms of entertainment for the children of the church, and also they moved out into what we would describe as local church missions, where they were providing this sort of entertainment for young children whom the ladies hoped would come into the church, attend Sunday school and the like. And that was beginning very nicely. By the time we get to 1890, we have some other things beginning to develop for us. Number one, we had our first golf course. Now, unfortunately, that particular course is long gone, but it was put in place by a man named Alexander Stoddard. Mr. Stoddard had made a lot of money in the insurance business in New York. He came to Pensacola. He became very interested in the city. He planted a lot of citrus groves in East Pensacola Heights, but apparently he had really begun to enjoy golf. So he set aside a large tract of land on what we would today call East Hill. And the first tee would have been right about where Lakeview Avenue and 12th Avenue come together today. And this was a 9-hole course. We don't know much more about it because it apparently did not last very long, because when Stoddard had some other difficulties along the way, that land was taken over for residential development, and consequently this went out of business. But golf itself had a resurrection, if you will, just a few years later, early into the 20th century, when a group of fashionable businessmen organized the first stage of the Pensacola Country Club right on the waterfront. They had purchased the former mansion of the industrialist Mr. James Kaiser. The Kaiser mansion remained there as the clubhouse, and Leonard Hilton Green and others put together the first 9 holes of that course. About the same time, they were able to purchase additional property that had belonged to the electric company, and so they had the space then to create an 18-hole course, and that was in effect, and I'm not sure exactly of the date, but it was well before World War I. So we have golf beginning to be played in that way. Well, about the same time, just early in the century, we find the workings now of the Pensacola Yacht Club. Now, the Yacht Club was a little bit of a gypsy for a time. They moved their headquarters from here to there to the other place. But basically, people have always, living on the water, have always enjoyed the idea of owning a boat and using it. And in the early days, the purpose of the Yacht Club was to own several vessels which could be used by their members. And that is exactly what it was. And of course, they, in time, after just a few years, they relocated from downtown. The original headquarters was right on or near Palafox Pier. They relocated and purchased at the end of World War I, they purchased a very unique a boat. I guess we should call it a boat, not a vessel. It was an experiment that was attempted by the United States Army. They built concrete boats. They had very strong engines in them. They were about 125 feet long, good sized vessels, very strong, but they were so heavy they could hardly move. And so the experiment itself was not a success. But one of the boats was purchased by the Yacht Club, and that became their headquarters. By the way, just incidentally, a second one of those vessels still exists. It is owned by a Brown Marine Company, is used as a kind of a game room or game place for them on Bayou Chico. So someday, if we were over in that area, you might enjoy seeing what a unique vessel this was. Well, as we move into the early part of the 20th century, the next thing that really became popular locally in terms of recreation was bicycling. The bicycle, of course, it had been around ever since the 1840s. The first ones, you didn't pedal in the normal sense. You pushed them with your feet. But by the time you got into the 1880s, both the mechanism was changing and improving, and then of course the kind of wheels and tires they were able to employ. And down near the waterfront, a company by the name of King and Runyon went into the bicycle business. And they sold all manner of vehicles, both for men and for women. They were the repair shop. They took care of the fixing wheels. And just as an incidental to that, wasn't too many years later, then a man whom we recognize and revere as our local historical icon, Tom Wentworth. He also went into the bicycle business. He sold and repaired bicycles over in East Hill. Well, as we move into the early part of the 20th century, new things begin to appear for us. First of all, we find here in 1903 the establishment of the YMCA. And the YMCA was, of course, dedicated to all sorts of physical fitness and good training in the Christian values, but they also began two other programs almost at once. One of these was a program to teach people how to swim, and for that they used facilities on what we today call Bayview Park, had a beautiful little setup for that, and they had all sorts of young men who provided teaching background and experience particularly for young people. YMCA, within a couple of years, also got into the era of teaching people boxing, and that became very, very effective here. And that YMCA boxing would be a high point when we finally built the bridge across Pensacola Bay and onto another bridge to Santa Rosa Island. And weekly boxing matches sponsored by the Y, of course, became very effective there. As we move a little bit further just into the 20th century, another thing that came upon the scene then, and we marked this in the year 1900, was Mardi Gras. Now, we had a Mardi Gras attempt in Pensacola in the mid-1870s. It tried for a year or so. It just didn't work at that time. But in 1900, a group of local men, led by the man who would, for a long time at least, was our tax collector, a man named Albert D'Alembert, and the Mardi Gras Association was created. The idea having something to recognize the change of seasons and also the coming of Lent. And the Mardi Gras began downtown, was very successful. It moved on, and with the exception of 2 years during the war and 1 year when there were financial difficulties in the 1920s, it continued on very successfully until we reached the Depression. And then, of course, the Mardi Gras became a casualty of the Depression, as did so many other things. Well, by the time we reached the early part of the 20th century, we begin to see something brand new beginning to come in terms of entertainment, and that was motion picture houses. We had very quickly, early in the century, we had the Ices, the Rex, and then the Florida, and of course, a little later in another episode, we're going to talk about the effects here when Julian Sanger came to Pensacola and built the Sanger Theater, one of our true icons.